A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was trying to kill her, which Celine thought was darkly appropriate considering everything else in her life had been trying to do the same thing for the past 2 years. And as she stumbled over another exposed root that seemed to reach up from the earth specifically to trip her already bleeding feet, she couldn't help but think that maybe the trees were just finishing what Damien had started 3 nights ago, when his hands had closed around her throat and squeezed until her vision went black, and she genuinely believed those would be her final moments on this earth. Her silver hair, which had once been her mother's pride, and the thing her father had loved to braid when she was small, now hung in matted tangles around her face, catching on every branch and thorn as if the forest itself was trying to hold her back, trying to drag her down, trying to make her stop running so that Damien and his hunting party could finally catch up to her and drag her back to the hell she'd escaped from. But Celine kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she'd already died so many times in that cabin over the past 2 years that her body had forgotten what it felt like to actually be alive. 3 days she'd been running, ever since that final beating when Damien had discovered she'd been sneaking food to the young Omega who lived 2 cabins down. The girl who'd been barely 16 and pregnant and starving because her own mate had abandoned her, and Celine had thought she'd been careful, had thought she'd hidden her kindness well enough that he wouldn't notice. But Damien noticed everything because controlling every aspect of her existence had become his favorite hobby, somewhere around month 6 of their forced mating. She could still hear his voice in her head, could still feel the way his breath had been hot and rancid with alcohol when he'd leaned in close after slamming her against the wall, could still remember the exact words he'd used when he'd told her that her compassion was going to get her killed one day because she was too stupid and too weak to understand that caring about anyone other than him was a betrayal that deserved punishment. The bruises on her throat from where he'd choked her were still dark purple and blue, standing out starkly against her pale skin that had always been too pale, too translucent, too ghost-like for anyone in Silver Creek Pack to look at without discomfort. And she knew the marks would fade eventually, but the memory of not being able to breathe, of clawing at his hands while he smiled down at her with that expression that said he was enjoying her suffering, that would never fade, no matter how long she lived. She'd waited until he'd passed out drunk that night, had gathered nothing but the thin dress she was wearing, because taking anything else would have woken him, and she'd run barefoot into the darkness with no plan, except to get as far away as possible before he woke up and realized she was gone, because she knew with absolute certainty that if he caught her this time, if he dragged her back this time, he would make sure she never had the strength or the opportunity to run again. Her feet were shredded now, cut open by rocks and thorns and 3 days of running through wilderness that wasn't meant to be traveled without proper shoes or supplies or any kind of protection, and every step sent sharp bolts of agony shooting up her legs. But the pain in her feet was nothing compared to the terror that lived in her chest like a living thing, constantly clawing at her lungs and making it hard to breathe, constantly reminding her that Damien was out there somewhere behind her, tracking her, hunting her, like she was prey that had dared to escape from its cage. The autumn air had turned cold in the past few hours, cold enough that she could see her breath misting in front of her face, and Celine knew that hypothermia was going to be a problem soon, because this thin, torn dress that had once been light blue but was now stained with dirt and blood and 3 days of desperate flight was not nearly enough protection against the dropping temperatures. She'd heard them earlier. had heard Damien's voice carrying through the trees, along with the voices of at least 4 other males from the pack, all of them calling out to her like they were trying to coax a frightened animal out of hiding, using that sickeningly sweet tone that promised safety while their scents told the truth about their intentions. And she'd forced herself to move faster, even though her body was screaming at her to stop, to rest, to just give up and let whatever was going to happen finally happen, because surely death would be better than this constant state of terror and exhaustion. The embankment appeared out of nowhere, hidden by the thick undergrowth and the gathering darkness, and Celine's foot came down on nothing but air where she'd expected solid ground, sending her tumbling forward in a cascade of loose dirt and dead leaves, her body rolling and bouncing off rocks and exposed roots until she landed hard at the bottom with a sickening crack that she felt more than heard as her left ankle twisted at an angle that ankles were definitely not meant to twist. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, white-hot and all-consuming, radiating up her leg in waves that made her stomach lurch and her vision swim with tears, and for a long moment she just lay there in the dirt, gasping for breath and trying not to scream, because screaming would bring them running, and she couldn't let them find her. She couldn't. She'd rather die right here in this ravine than let Damien put his hands on her ever again. Moving was agony, every shift of her body sending fresh jolts of pain through her injured ankle. But Celine forced herself to crawl toward a fallen log that offered at least the illusion of shelter, dragging her useless leg behind her and biting down on her lip hard enough to draw blood, because she needed the smaller pain to distract from the larger one, needed something to focus on. Besides the knowledge that she couldn't run anymore, couldn't keep going, was well and truly trapped now, with nowhere to hide and no way to escape what was coming. She managed to wedge herself into the space between the log and the ground, pulling dead leaves and debris over her body in a futile attempt at camouflage, and then she just lay there shaking, whether from cold or fear or shock, she couldn't tell anymore, because all 3 had become so intertwined in her body that they felt like one single sensation of overwhelming wrongness. The voices were getting closer, Damien's cutting through the forest like a blade, and she could hear him calling her name in that particular tone he used when he was pretending to be concerned while actually being furious, the tone that meant she was going to pay dearly for whatever perceived transgression she'd committed. And Celine felt something inside her chest crack open, felt whatever small piece of hope she'd been clinging to finally shatter and fall away, because this was it. This was how her story ended, caught and broken at the bottom of a ravine, with an ankle that wouldn't support her weight and no strength left to fight with. She thought about her parents, dead now for 8 years, killed by rogues who'd swept through their small pack territory like a violent storm, and she wondered if they'd be disappointed in her for ending up like this, for allowing herself to be mated to a monster, for not being strong enough or smart enough or brave enough to escape before it came to this desperate, pathetic end where she died alone and terrified in the dirt like an animal. That's when she heard them, different footsteps moving through the forest with a coordination and purpose that was distinctly unlike Damien's drunken hunting party. And Celine held her breath as 12 massive shapes materialized out of the darkness, moving along the game trail above her hiding spot with the kind of synchronized precision that spoke of military training and pack discipline. Wolves, all of them in their animal forms, all of them enormous in a way that suggested alpha or beta blood, and all of them marked with unusual silver accents in their fur that seemed to catch what little moonlight filtered through the canopy and make it glow with an almost supernatural quality. They were clearly elite warriors from one of the major packs, probably on patrol through neutral territory, and every survival instinct Celine possessed was screaming at her to stay hidden to stay quiet, to let them pass by without ever knowing she was there, because getting involved with strange wolves when she was this vulnerable was just asking for a different kind of death than the one Damien would provide. But then the largest wolf stopped, a massive silver and white beast that stood at least 4 feet at the wide shoulder with eyes that gleamed an unusual shade of silver blue in the darkness. And Celine watched as his head turned slowly in her direction, watched as his nostrils flared like he was scenting the air, watched as those intelligent eyes seemed to look directly at her hiding spot, even though she knew there was no way he could see her through the debris and the darkness. The wolf took a step toward the edge of the embankment, and something in Celine broke completely, something that had been holding her together through sheer stubborn will for the past 3 days, finally gave way under the weight of her exhaustion and her terror and her absolute certainty that she was going to die here tonight one way or another. And before she could stop herself, before rational thought could intervene, she was dragging her broken body out from under the log and pulling herself up onto the game trail directly in front of the 12 wolves. They could have killed her in seconds, could have torn her apart before she even finished moving. But instead, they all just stood there. 12 pairs of eyes fixed on her with expressions that ranged from surprise to concern to something that might have been recognition. And Celine found herself looking up at the largest wolf, the one with the silver blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And words were spilling out of her mouth before she could think about what she was saying or whether begging strange wolves for help was actually more dangerous than what she was running from. Her voice came out rough and broken, barely more than a whisper, because Damien's hands had damaged something in her throat when he choked her. But she forced the words out anyway, because this was her last chance, her final desperate gamble before Damien's party caught up to her and ended this nightmare in the worst possible way. "Please," she heard herself saying, and the word came out like a prayer or a confession or a final wish made to the moon goddess herself. "Please help me. He's coming. I can hear him coming. And if he finds me, he's going to kill me this time. I know he is because I ran, and he'll never forgive me for running. And I'm sorry for bothering you. I'm sorry for being in your way. I'm sorry for existing at all. But please, please don't let him take me back. I'll do anything. I'll serve your pack. I'll clean or heal or whatever you need. I'll be useful. I promise I'll be useful. Just please don't let him find me. Please don't leave me here to die." The words kept coming, tumbling over each other in a desperate rush of pleading and apologies. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Celine recognized that she was probably scaring them away with her hysteria, that no sane pack would want to get involved with whatever mess she was dragging behind her. But she couldn't stop talking, because if she stopped talking, she'd start screaming, and if she started screaming, she'd never stop. The large wolf moved then, and Celine instinctively tried to scramble backward, her injured ankle screaming in protest, her body automatically assuming that any movement from a powerful male meant violence was coming. But instead of attacking, instead of walking away, instead of doing any of the logical things a strange wolf should do when confronted with a hysterical, injured omega babbling nonsense at them in the middle of the night, the wolf shifted, the transformation happening so smoothly and quickly that one moment there was a massive silver animal, and the next moment there was a man, tall and powerful and marked with muscles that spoke of a lifetime of training, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and those same piercing silver blue eyes that had been watching her so intently. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and calm and so unbearably gentle that Celine felt something in her chest crack open even wider, because she couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her with anything resembling kindness. "Easy," the man said, and he was lowering himself slowly to one knee. making himself smaller and less threatening, even though everything about his bearing screamed alpha, screamed power, screamed dangerous in ways that should have sent her running if she'd had anywhere left to run to. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise you're safe now. No one here is going to harm you in any way." His eyes never left hers as he spoke, and Celine found herself unable to look away, found herself caught in that silver blue gaze that seemed to see every bruise, every scar, every broken piece of her that she tried so hard to hide from the world. And there was something in his expression that looked like fury mixed with anguish, mixed with a fierce protectiveness that made absolutely no sense because he didn't know her, had no reason to care whether she lived or died, had no obligation to get involved in the disaster that was her life. The sound of Damien's voice calling her name echoed through the trees, closer now, maybe only 5 minutes away, and Celine felt panic surge through her body like a physical force, felt her lungs seize up and her vision start to tunnel, felt every muscle in her body prepare to either fight or flee, even though she was capable of doing neither in her current state. The silver-haired man's eyes sharpened as he heard the voice, and something dangerous flickered across his face, something that promised violence to anyone who threatened what he considered his to protect. And then he was speaking again, his voice still gentle, but with an undercurrent of absolute authority that made it clear this was not a man who was used to being disobeyed or questioned about anything. "Who's coming?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question so much as a command for information. "Who are you running from, and why do you think he's going to kill you?" Celine's mouth opened and closed several times before any words would come out, her mind racing through all the possible ways this could go wrong, all the ways these strange wolves might decide that helping an escaped mate was more trouble than it was worth, all the ways they might simply hand her back to Damien to avoid whatever political complications her presence might cause, because that's what always happened to Omegas like her. Omegas with no pack, no protection, no value beyond what their mates decided they were worth. The silver-haired man was still watching her with those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to glow slightly in the moonlight, and there was something about his presence that made her want to tell him everything, made her want to pour out the whole sordid story of how she'd ended up here, broken and bleeding at the bottom of a ravine, begging strangers for salvation that she had no right to expect and probably didn't deserve anyway, because if she'd been stronger, smarter, better, she would have found a way to escape years ago before Damien had systematically destroyed every piece of who she used to be. "My mate," she finally managed to say, and the word tasted like poison on her tongue, bitter and toxic and wrong in ways that made her want to spit it out and never speak it again. "Damien Blackthorn from Silver Creek Pack, he's hunting me. He brought at least 4 others with him, and I ran 3 days ago after he tried to kill me, and I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking, that I'm just some hysterical Omega making up stories about her mate because I'm too weak to handle proper discipline. But I swear I'm telling the truth. I swear he's going to kill me if he catches me, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have anyone else to ask. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this mess, but I'm out of options and out of time, and I just need someone to help me. Just this once, just long enough to get away from him." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in her desperation to make him understand, to make him see that she wasn't lying, or exaggerating, or being dramatic, that the danger she was running from was real and immediate, and absolutely going to end in her death if these wolves turned her away. The man's expression darkened considerably as she spoke, his jaw tightening, and his eyes taking on a quality that reminded Celine of winter storms, cold and fierce and potentially devastating to anyone caught in their path. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something low and dangerous that sent shivers down her spine for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way her traitorous body was responding to the protective fury radiating from him in waves. "Did he put those bruises on your throat?" the man asked, and his eyes had moved to her neck, where she knew the finger-shaped marks were still clearly visible, dark purple and blue, and impossible to hide or explain away as anything other than what they were. Evidence of someone's hands wrapped around her windpipe with the clear intention of cutting off her air supply until she stopped breathing entirely. "And the cuts on your arms, and the way you're favoring that ankle. Did he do all of that to you?" Celine wanted to lie, wanted to protect Damien the way she'd been conditioned to protect him for the past 2 years, wanted to make excuses about how she'd fallen, or been clumsy, or somehow brought this all on herself through her own failures and inadequacies. But something about the way this stranger was looking at her, something about the genuine concern and barely controlled rage in his expression, made the truth come spilling out before she could stop it. "He choked me 3 nights ago when he found out I'd been giving food to a pregnant Omega who was starving," she heard herself confessing, and her hand moved unconsciously to her throat as if she could still feel Damien's fingers there, still feel the pressure building as her vision went dark and her lungs screamed for air that wouldn't come. "And he's hit me more times than I can count over the past 2 years. And he broke my ribs once when I asked if I could visit the pack healer because I was sick. And he dislocated my shoulder when I smiled at another male during a pack gathering. And he told me that I was worthless and stupid and that no one would ever want me or believe me if I tried to tell anyone what he was doing. And he was right, because I told the pack alpha once, early on, and the alpha said that what happened between mates was private and that I needed to learn to be more obedient and stop causing problems." The silver-haired man's expression had gone from concerned to absolutely murderous as she spoke, and Celine watched as his hands clenched into fists at his sides, watched as the muscles in his jaw worked like he was physically restraining himself from shifting back into his wolf form and going to hunt down Damien right that moment. And the 11 other wolves behind him had moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around her that made her feel simultaneously safer and more terrified, because she didn't understand why these strangers were reacting so strongly to her situation, didn't understand what they could possibly gain from involving themselves in the disaster that was her life. "Your pack alpha told you that abuse was acceptable as long as it happened in private," the man said, and his voice had taken on a quality that suggested he was barely holding on to his control, barely keeping himself from doing something violent and probably permanent to everyone involved in Celine's suffering. "Your alpha heard that your mate was beating you and told you it was your fault for not being obedient enough, and then left you in a situation where that male continued to hurt you for 2 more years until you finally had no choice but to run or die." It wasn't a question, more like a statement of facts that he was laying out in order to fully comprehend the depth of the injustice. But Celine nodded. Anyway, feeling tears start to slide down her cheeks because having someone actually acknowledge what had been done to her, having someone react with appropriate horror and anger instead of indifference or blame, was somehow breaking through defenses she'd built up over years of being told that her pain didn't matter and her suffering was her own fault. "I shouldn't have run," she found herself saying, because even now, even after everything, Damien's voice was still in her head telling her that she was breaking sacred laws, that running from your mate was the worst kind of betrayal, that she deserved whatever punishment was coming for daring to defy the bond that tied them together. "I broke bond law by leaving without his permission, and the council will side with him because he's a beta and I'm just an omega, and he'll tell them I'm crazy or lying or that I deserve discipline because I was disobedient. And they'll believe him, because they always believe the males, and I'll be sent back, and he'll make sure I never get another chance to escape." The man moved then, slowly and carefully so as not to startle her, and he reached out one hand toward her face, stopping just short of actually touching her, his palm hovering near her cheek like he was asking permission. And Celine found herself leaning into that almost touch without meaning to, found herself craving the gentleness in the gesture, even as every instinct she possessed screamed that letting anyone get this close was dangerous. That trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. That kindness from powerful males always came with a price she'd eventually be forced to pay. "Listen to me very carefully," the man said, and his voice had gentled again, though the fury was still there underneath, banked but not extinguished. "You didn't break any laws that matter. You exercised your right to preserve your own life, and no legitimate counsel would ever send someone back to a mate who was actively trying to kill them, which means your pack's counsel is either corrupt or incompetent or both, and regardless, you're not going back to him, not now, not ever, because I'm not going to let that happen." Damien's voice called out again, close enough now that Celine could make out the words, could hear him promising that he wasn't angry, that he just wanted to talk, that if she came out now he'd forgive her for running, and everything would go back to normal. And the lies in those words were so transparent, so obviously false, that Celine wondered how she'd ever believed anything that came out of his mouth. "He's almost here," she whispered, and panic was rising in her chest like a flood, threatening to drown her, threatening to drag her under and never let her surface again. "He's going to find me, and you need to go. You need to leave before he sees you helping me, because he'll challenge you. He'll try to fight you for interfering. And I can't be responsible for someone else getting hurt because of me. I can't carry that weight, too. I'm already carrying so much, and I can't. I just can't." The silver-haired man's eyes softened as he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like wonder mixed with the protective fury, like he was seeing something in her that she couldn't see in herself, something valuable and worth protecting that had nothing to do with her usefulness or her obedience or any of the other metrics by which she'd been judged and found wanting her entire life. "What's your name?" he asked, and the question seemed to come out of nowhere, seemed completely irrelevant to the crisis happening around them, but something about the way he asked it, the way he was looking at her like her answer actually mattered, made Celine want to give him whatever he was asking for. "Celine," she said, and it felt strange to speak her own name after so long of being called nothing but Omega or girl or various other terms that reduced her to her designation and erased her personhood. "Celine Ashwood, and I don't know who you are or why you're being kind to me, but I'm grateful, even if it doesn't help, even if Damien finds me anyway. I'm grateful that someone finally listened, that someone finally cared enough to ask what happened instead of just assuming I deserved it." The man smiled then, and it transformed his face from merely handsome into something almost devastating, something that made Celine's breath catch in her throat for reasons that had nothing to do with Damien's hands, and everything to do with the way this stranger was looking at her, like she was something precious that he'd been searching for, and had finally, miraculously, found. "My name is Theron," he said, and he was still not quite touching her face, though his hand remained there, hovering, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "And I'm going to need you to trust me. Just for the next few minutes, can you do that, Celine? Can you trust that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you? That I'm going to handle this situation and make sure you're safe?" Celine wanted to say no, wanted to tell him that trust was something she'd given away too freely in the past and had learned through bitter experience to guard carefully because trusting the wrong person could get you killed. But there was something about Theron, something about the way he spoke to her and looked at her and asked, instead of demanded. That made her want to believe him, even though belief felt dangerous and foolish and likely to end in more pain. "I don't know how to trust anymore," she admitted, and the confession felt like exposing the rawest part of herself, like showing him the damaged, broken core that Damien had spent 2 years creating through systematic cruelty and calculated destruction. "I don't know how to believe that someone would help me without wanting something in return, without eventually deciding I'm too much trouble and throwing me away like everyone else has." Theron's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pain, like her words had hurt him in some fundamental way. And when he finally did touch her, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to cry, she found herself leaning into the contact instead of flinching away. "Then don't trust me yet," he said, and his thumb was moving slowly across her cheekbone, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. "Just watch what I do, watch how I handle this, and then decide for yourself whether I'm someone worth believing in. But Celine, I need you to understand something important. I need you to know that from this moment forward, you're under my protection, which means that anyone who wants to get to you is going to have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's not going to happen." The sound of multiple footsteps crashing through the underbrush made them both turn, and suddenly Damien was there, bursting through the tree line with 4 other males from Silver Creek Pack flanking him, all of them in human form, all of them stopping short when they saw Celine surrounded by 12 massive wolves and one silver-haired man who was currently positioned between her and them like a living shield. Damien's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, surprise giving way to anger, giving way to something that looked almost like fear, before settling on a mask of false concern that Celine recognized all too well. The expression he wore in public when he wanted people to think he was a reasonable, caring mate, instead of the monster he became behind closed doors. "There you are, sweetheart," Damien said, and his voice was dripping with false relief, with manufactured worry that would have fooled anyone who didn't know him, who hadn't spent 2 years learning to read the subtle signs of his moods. "I've been so worried about you, running off like that in the middle of the night. You must have been having one of your episodes, but it's okay now. I'm here to take you home where you belong, where you'll be safe." His eyes moved to Theron as he spoke, and Celine saw calculation there, saw him trying to figure out who this stranger was, and whether he represented a threat or just an inconvenience that could be dealt with through the usual combination of charm and intimidation that Damien used to get his way. Theron stood slowly, moving to his full height, which Celine now realized was considerably taller than Damien, and when he spoke, his voice had gone cold and formal, completely different from the gentle tone he'd been using with her. And there was something in his bearing that screamed authority, that suggested he was someone used to being obeyed without question. "The Omega has requested sanctuary from abuse," Theron said, and each word was precise and carefully enunciated, like he was laying down facts that could not be disputed or argued with. "She has visible injuries consistent with her claims, and under Moon Goddess law, any alpha has the right and the obligation to provide protection to those fleeing domestic violence, regardless of pack affiliation or territorial boundaries." Damien's false concern slipped slightly, his expression hardening into something more familiar, more dangerous. And Celine felt herself starting to shake because she knew that look, knew what it meant when Damien's mask started to crack and the real him began showing through. "With all due respect," Damien said, and there was no respect in his tone at all, only barely controlled fury and possessive rage. "That Omega is my bonded mate, legally recognized by Silver Creek Pack and the Regional Council, which means what happens between us is none of your concern.
and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop interfering in private pack matters and hand her over before this becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be." Theron's eyes narrowed, and Selene watched as the 11 wolves behind him all shifted slightly, moving into what she recognized as defensive positions, coordinated and precise in a way that suggested extensive military training. And suddenly, she was realizing that these weren't just random border patrol wolves. These were elite warriors, the kind of pack that didn't answer to regional councils because they were above that level of authority. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Theron said, and his voice had dropped even lower, had taken on a quality that made the hair on the back of Selene's neck stand up in response to the alpha power radiating from him. "Because, as of 5 minutes ago, when Selene requested my protection, and I granted it, she became a resident of Northern Territory under my personal guardianship, which means that any attempt to take her by force will be considered an act of aggression against my pack, and I promise you that's not a fight you want to start." The name Northern Territory hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped, and Selene watched as Damien's face went pale, watched as recognition and fear flickered across his features before he could hide them, and she found herself wondering what was so significant about that name, what it meant that these wolves claimed to be from there. But before she could process it further, Damien was stepping forward, his hands clenched into fists, his whole body vibrating with barely suppressed violence. "You can't just steal another male's mate," Damien snarled, and his composure was completely gone now, the mask shattered and the monster fully visible. "Bond law says she belongs to me, that I have rights to her, and no jumped-up border patrol is going to tell me otherwise, so I suggest you hand over my property right now before I'm forced to take her back myself and file a formal complaint with your alpha about your complete disregard for established law." Theron moved then, faster than Selene would have thought possible for someone his size, and suddenly he was directly in front of Damien, towering over him. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of command that made even Selene want to drop to her knees in submission, despite the fact that the command wasn't directed at her. "She is not property," Theron said, and each word came out like a physical blow, like something solid and undeniable that could not be argued with or dismissed. "She is a living being with inherent worth and the right to safety, and the bond you're claiming is void because it was formed and maintained through coercion and violence, which means you have no legal claim to her whatsoever. And if you take one more step toward her, if you even think about challenging my authority to protect her, I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your considerably shortened life regretting every moment you spent terrorizing someone who couldn't fight back." The tension in the clearing had reached a breaking point, the air so thick with alpha dominance and barely restrained violence that Selene could feel it pressing against her skin like a physical force. And she watched in horrified fascination as Damien's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from fury to calculation to something that looked almost like genuine fear when he finally seemed to process what Theron had said, seemed to understand the implications of the words Northern Territory and the casual way this silver-haired stranger had threatened to end his life without even raising his voice. Damien took a step backward, his eyes darting between Theron and the 12 massive wolves that were now watching him with the kind of focused intensity that predators reserved for prey they were about to take down. And Selene could see the exact moment when he realized he was outmatched, when his survival instincts finally overrode his possessive rage and told him that whatever he'd been planning to do was going to get him killed if he followed through with it. "Northern Territory," Damien repeated, and his voice had lost all its earlier bravado, had taken on a quality that suggested he was reassessing everything he'd thought he knew about this situation. "You're saying you're from the Northern Crown Pack? From the Royal Territory itself. And that means you're either lying to scare me or you're actually someone important enough that interfering with you would be political suicide. His eyes moved to Theron's forearm, to the distinctive silver markings that Celine now noticed were peeking out from beneath his sleeve. Markings that looked almost like tattoos, but had a quality that suggested they were something more, something that couldn't be replicated or faked. And she watched as Damien's face went even paler, watched as genuine terror replaced the anger in his expression. Theron didn't respond to Damien's observation, didn't confirm or deny anything, just stood there radiating power and authority, while one of the other wolves, a massive beast with dark fur and silver accents, moved forward and shifted into human form, revealing a man who looked to be in his early 30s with the kind of battle-scarred face that spoke of years spent in combat. "My name is Captain Riker," the man said, and his voice carried the clipped professional tone of someone giving an official report. "And I serve as head of the elite guard for the Northern Crown, which means that the male you're currently threatening is under my protection, and I'm authorized to inform you that you and your companions need to leave this territory immediately, or we will be forced to consider your presence here an act of hostile intent that requires a more permanent solution." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Celine watched as Damien's 4 companions all took several steps backward, clearly wanting no part of whatever confrontation was brewing, clearly understanding that they'd somehow stumbled into a situation that was way beyond their ability to handle. Damien himself looked like he was struggling with some internal battle, his desire to reclaim what he considered his property warring with his survival instincts that were screaming at him to cut his losses and retreat while he still had the option. And Celine found herself holding her breath, found herself caught between hope and terror as she waited to see which impulse would win out. "This isn't over," Damien finally said, and his voice was shaking with suppressed rage and humiliation. "I have legal rights to her. We have a recognized bond, and I will be filing a formal complaint with the Council of Alphas about your interference in a domestic matter, and when the tribunal rules in my favor, when they order her returned to me, you'll have no choice but to comply with Moon Goddess law, and then she'll be back where she belongs, and I'll make sure she pays for every single moment of trouble she's caused." His eyes moved to Celine as he spoke, and the promise of violence in that gaze was so clear, so undisguised, that she felt her whole body start to shake, felt terror flooding through her system as she imagined what he would do to her if he ever got his hands on her again. Theron's response was immediate and devastating, his hand shooting out faster than Celine could track, grabbing Damien by the throat and lifting him slightly off the ground, with a display of strength that seemed almost casual despite the fact that he was holding a full-grown male wolf in the air, like he weighed nothing at all. "Let me make something abundantly clear," Theron said, and his voice had gone deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "If you ever look at her like that again, if you ever threaten her again, if you ever so much as think about putting your hands on her again, I will consider it a personal declaration of war, and I will respond accordingly, which means you will die slowly and painfully after watching everything you care about burn to the ground around you. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" Damien was clawing at Theron's hand, trying to breathe, his face turning red and then purple as his air supply was cut off, and Celine felt a sick sort of satisfaction watching him experience exactly what he'd done to her 3 nights ago, watching him understand how terrifying it was to be at someone else's mercy with no way to fight back. But that satisfaction was quickly replaced by something else, something that felt almost like pity, because even after everything Damien had done to her, even after 2 years of systematic abuse and cruelty, she still didn't want to watch him die.
still couldn't quite suppress the part of her that had been trained to care about others, even when they didn't deserve it. "Theron," she heard herself saying, and her voice came out soft and uncertain. "Please let him go. Please don't kill him on my account. I don't want his death on my conscience. I don't want to be responsible for more violence. I just want him gone. I just want to be free." Theron's eyes moved to her, and something in her expression must have gotten through to him, because he released Damien immediately, letting him drop to the ground where he collapsed in a gasping, choking heap. And when Theron spoke again, his voice had gentled considerably, though the underlying threat remained crystal clear. "You have exactly 60 seconds to get out of my sight," Theron said, and he was addressing Damien without looking at him, his eyes still fixed on Celine like he was making sure she was all right. "And if I ever see you again, if you ever come looking for her, if you ever try to challenge the protection I've granted her, I won't be merciful a second time. Now run before I change my mind and let my guards have their fun with you." Damien and his companions didn't need to be told twice, scrambling to their feet and disappearing into the forest with a speed that would have been comical under different circumstances. And Selina watched them go with a mixture of relief and disbelief, unable to quite process that they were actually leaving, that Damien had actually backed down, that she was actually, genuinely, possibly safe for the first time in 2 years. The moment they were out of sight, the moment the sound of their retreat had faded into the distance, Celine felt her legs give out completely, felt whatever adrenaline had been holding her upright finally drain away, and she would have collapsed face first into the dirt if Theron hadn't moved with that impossible speed again, catching her before she could fall, lifting her into his arms like she weighed absolutely nothing, and holding her against his chest with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence he'd just displayed. "I've got you," Theron murmured, and his voice was back to that soft, careful tone he'd used when he first spoke to her. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe, and I'm going to take you somewhere warm and secure, where you can rest and heal, and we'll figure out everything else later. But right now, all you need to do is breathe and know that you're protected." Selene wanted to respond, wanted to thank him or ask him questions, or say something that would adequately express the overwhelming gratitude and confusion and desperate hope that was flooding through her system. But she was so exhausted, so completely drained by 3 days of running and the terror of the confrontation and the shock of being rescued when she'd been certain she was going to die, that all she could do was nod weakly and let herself relax into his hold. The next few hours passed in a blur of movement and warmth and gentle voices speaking words she couldn't quite process through the fog of exhaustion that had settled over her brain. And Celine had vague impressions of being carried through the forest, of arriving at a small cabin that was warm and clean and safe, of being settled onto a bed that felt impossibly soft after 3 days of sleeping on the ground, of someone carefully cleaning and bandaging her injured ankle while speaking in soothing tones that promised she didn't need to be afraid anymore. When she finally woke up fully, sunlight was streaming through a window she didn't recognize, and for a long moment she just lay there in confusion, trying to remember where she was and how she'd gotten there. And then it all came flooding back. The running, the begging, the confrontation. Theron's silver blue eyes looking at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. She found him outside the cabin, chopping wood with smooth, practiced movements that spoke of years of physical labor, despite the fact that everything else about him suggested he was someone who probably had servants to handle such mundane tasks. And when he noticed her standing in the doorway, his face transformed with a smile that made her breath catch in her throat because she'd forgotten what genuine warmth looked like on someone's face, forgotten what it felt like to be looked at with something other than contempt or possessive anger, or indifferent dismissal. "You're awake," Theron said, and he was setting down the axe and moving toward her, careful not to approach too quickly, still giving her space to retreat if she wanted to. "How are you feeling? Are you in pain? Do you need anything? Water or food or medical attention?" The question was so genuinely concerned, so completely focused on her well-being, without any hidden agenda or expectation of something in return, that Celine felt tears start to well up in her eyes again, because she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked how she was feeling and actually cared about the answer. "I'm okay," she managed to say, even though it wasn't entirely true, even though her ankle was throbbing and her throat still hurt and her whole body ached from 3 days of abuse and neglect. "Or at least I will be, eventually, and I need to thank you. I need to tell you how grateful I am for what you did, for protecting me when you had no reason to, for believing me when everyone else told me I was lying or exaggerating or deserving of what happened to me." Theron's expression softened even further, and he was close enough now that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his silver eyes, could see the concern and something else, something that looked almost like wonder mixed with fierce protectiveness, written clearly across his features. "You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent wolf should do," Theron said, and his hand was moving up like he wanted to touch her face again, hovering near her cheek in that same asking gesture he'd used before. "And I need you to understand something, Celine. I need you to know that what I told Damien wasn't just posturing or empty threats. You really are under my protection now, which means you're safe here for as long as you need to be, whether that's days or weeks or years. You have a place here, and no one is going to force you to leave or send you back or make you do anything you don't want to do." The promise in those words, the absolute certainty with which he spoke them, made something in Celine's chest crack open even wider, made years of built-up fear and pain start to drain away like poison being drawn from a wound, and she found herself leaning into his almost touch, found herself craving the comfort and safety he was offering, even though every self-preservation instinct she possessed was screaming that this was too good to be true, that kindness from powerful males always came with conditions and prices that would eventually be revealed. "Why?" she whispered, and the question encompassed everything she couldn't quite articulate. Why he was helping her, why he cared, why he was being so gentle when he could have just sent her away. "Why are you doing all this for someone you don't even know? Someone who's just going to be trouble and bring complications into your life? Someone who isn't worth all this effort?" Theron's hand finally made contact with her cheek, cupping her face with that same unbearable gentleness. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that she couldn't quite identify, but that made her want to cry for reasons she didn't fully understand. "Because the moment I saw you, broken and terrified, and still brave enough to ask for help, I knew you were someone worth protecting," Theron said, and his thumb was moving across her cheekbone in slow, soothing strokes. "And because I've been searching for something my entire life, something I didn't even know I was looking for until I found you lying in that ravine with silver hair like moonlight and eyes that held more strength than you realize. And because from the moment you spoke, from the moment you looked at me and asked me not to leave you to die, I felt something in my chest recognize something in yours, and I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that trust isn't always betrayed, that kindness doesn't always come with conditions, that you're worth everything I said you were and more." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Celine wasn't quite ready to examine, wasn't quite prepared to believe, even though something in her soul was whispering that he was telling the truth, that this connection she felt with him wasn't just desperation or gratitude or the trauma bond of a rescued victim to her rescuer, but something deeper, something real, something that the moon goddess herself might have had a hand in creating. "I don't know how to believe that," Celine admitted, and her voice was shaking with the weight of 2 years of conditioning that had taught her she was worthless and unlovable and deserving of whatever cruelty came her way. "I don't know how to trust that this is real and not just another trap, not just another person who's going to use my vulnerability against me and hurt me when I let my guard down." Theron's other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly, making sure she was looking directly into his eyes when he spoke, and what she saw there was so honest, so genuinely full of emotion and promise, and something that looked almost like love at first sight, even though that was impossible, that she felt her carefully constructed walls starting to crumble, despite her best efforts to keep them intact. "Then don't believe it yet," Theron said, and his forehead was resting against hers now, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face, close enough that she could count his heartbeats if she wanted to. "Don't trust me yet. Don't let your guard down yet. Just stay here with me and let me show you through my actions instead of my words that you're safe, that you're valued, that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And eventually, when you're ready, when you've had time to heal and to see that I mean every promise I'm making, then you can decide whether you want to trust me, whether you want to accept what I'm offering, whether you want to explore what this connection between us might become, if we give it a chance to grow." The words wrapped around Celine like a warm blanket, like protection and promise and hope, all rolled into one, and she found herself nodding, even though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to, found herself leaning further into his touch, even though touching had been a source of pain for so long that she'd forgotten it could be anything else. "Okay," she whispered, and the word felt like a beginning, like the first step on a journey she couldn't quite see the end of, but was willing to take anyway, because the alternative was going back to the darkness and the fear and the constant pain of a life that wasn't really living at all. "Okay, I'll stay. I'll let you try to prove that not all alphas are like Damien, that not all kindness is manipulation, that maybe, possibly, I might actually deserve something better than what I've been settling for." Theron's smile when she agreed was so brilliant, so full of joy and relief and something that looked suspiciously like the beginning of love, that Celine felt an answering warmth start to kindle in her own chest, small and fragile, but definitely there, a tiny flame of hope that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end in darkness and despair, that maybe there was a different path available to her now, one that led toward healing and safety, and the kind of love that built people up instead of tearing them down. They stood there for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync, and Selene thought about how 3 days ago she'd been certain she was going to die alone in the forest. And now she was standing in the sunlight being held by someone who looked at her like she was precious. And the contrast was so stark, so overwhelming, that she couldn't quite process it except to acknowledge that the moon goddess worked in mysterious ways, and that sometimes, when you were running from death, you accidentally ran straight into life instead. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Celine knew that healing from 2 years of systematic abuse wasn't something that would happen overnight, knew that learning to trust again and believe in her own worth was going to be a long and difficult process, full of setbacks and moments of doubt. But as she stood there in Theron's arms, feeling safer than she'd felt in years, feeling seen and valued, and protected in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She thought that maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to start that journey, ready to stop running and start building something new from the broken pieces of who she used to be. She'd run away from her abusive mate and begged a stranger for help, not knowing he was the Alpha King, not knowing he would become her salvation and possibly her future, not knowing that the worst night of her life would turn out to be the beginning of something beautiful. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Theron held her close and promised her tomorrow and the day after and all the tomorrows she wanted to claim, Celine finally let herself believe that maybe, possibly, hopefully, she was going to be okay, that she was going to survive this, that she was going to do more than just survive. She was going to heal and grow, and eventually, when she was ready, she was going to love again. But this time, it would be real love, chosen love, the kind of love that freed instead of caged, and that made all the running and all the fear and all the pain worth it, because it had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this chance at a life worth living. If you enjoyed Celine and Theron's story of survival, healing, and finding love in the aftermath of trauma, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales featuring powerful alphas, brave omegas, rejected mates who find their true destinies, and stories about choosing love over fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and you'll be the first to know when new stories are available. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this journey from desperation to hope. Whether Celine's healing resonated with you, what moment impacted you most, and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Whether it's more protective alphas, forbidden bonds, second chance mates, or entirely new dynamics you're curious to explore. Your support means absolutely everything and helps me create more content like this. More stories about finding strength in vulnerability and discovering that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to the best moments waiting just beyond them. Thank you so much for reading, for investing your time and emotion in Celine's journey, and I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore another tale of wolves and destiny and love that refuses to be denied.